Hello, everyone. So before we get started on chapter 9, or chapter 8, yep, thank you. It should say chapter 8. I think I fixed it everywhere else, but the title slide is wrong. I just wanted to elaborate on what I had talked about last Friday, where I want to, this coming Friday, give you guys a chance to look over your midterms if that's something you're interested in. And I kind of planned out how much content I have to cover till the end of the semester. So I think, depending on how much we get through today, we should be in a pretty good place where I can teach sort of Monday and Wednesday this week. And then we can have Friday as the opportunity to go over the exams if you want to, ask questions, and just sort of have like a free forum. So if you aren't interested in that, you don't have to come. And then if you are interested in it, then you just sort of show up and we can go through stuff as a group. And then we'll get back to lecture stuff Monday, Wednesday next week as well. And then theoretically, we'll be wrapping up Wednesday next week, which will leave us Friday next week as like a review period. So if you have questions or whatever, it'll be another sort of free form session where attendance is optional. So that's what I'm planning right now, and I can say for sure if we can get through all the slides today, then we'll be good. You will be able to look at them, but you can't keep them. Yeah. And so I'll be able to show you, I think what I'll probably do is I'll use the projector to show you the answer key. And then if you have specific questions, we can do that. Yep. The final is, oh no, it went away. Curses. The 6th? Yeah? Okay, good. I had pulled it up and then it deleted my tabs because everything restarted. But yes, so I'll make like a big sort of last 2-week summary and I'll include the final date because I'm fairly certain they removed the draft from their statement. And then I'll give you the details again for Fridays being sort of study and midterm material. Okay, cool. And then I'm also aiming to have your written assignments back to you by Wednesday at the latest. And then that way, if you have questions about those as well, we can talk about them on Friday if that's something you're interested in. I'm taking my time and actually putting comments on them so that you can kind of see what my thought process was. And then if you have questions, you can email me or we can do it in person. Yep. Yes. Well, yes, the intent is they'll be up on Wednesday, but for sure by Friday, you'll be able to pull them up in class. And then if I finish them earlier, then you just have them earlier. But things have been a little bit chaotic lately, so that happens. All right. Okay, so if we are good, then I'm going to get started on our last chapter. And so we're going to be talking about both language and thought, which at the surface kind of seems like a really strange combination of topics. But if we think about it, and especially with the direction that the text takes, we start considering how the way that we talk about things also shapes the way that we think about things. So we're going to start seeing how we develop language, what areas of the brain are involved in language, and then how we use language. And then we'll transition over into how it affects our thought and how we think about things. So for today, we're just going to be focusing on what language is, some of the terms that you're going to be seeing when we talk about language. And then I believe we talk about the brain areas that are involved. So a little bit of review. I'm actually used to teaching this chapter as chapter 9 for 105 because at a different university with a different textbook, they split it up a different way. And so I have to do language without having done brain areas that are involved in stuff. So it's a lot more review in that class. But you guys will have an advantage here because we've talked about areas of the brain. So this will be more of an expansion on what we've talked about as opposed to, hey, remember back when. So hopefully it goes well. Oh dear. And I forgot, one of my birds was helping with grading this weekend and stole the down arrow on my laptop. So I don't actually have that anymore. But nothing like that to jar you out of your lecture. All right, so our first slide, as per usual, is their general question. Okay, if we're going to talk about language, what is language? And this is another one of those things where it's kind of hard to get a solid definition. And as someone who's studied communication in non-human species, because I've looked at how chickadees communicate, they are very precise about how and when you can apply language terminology. So I'll try and make a distinction between like general non-human communication and then the language. So we're going to focus in on what characteristics are they looking for to make it specifically a language, as opposed to just generic communication of information. So we're going to focus on the fact that language consists of a system of symbols and rules that are going to determine how you can put those symbols together. So combining those symbols can generate an infinite number of possible messages and meanings. So we're looking at this being generative, meaning you can put together things in new ways and say new things. And it's going to be using sort of an existing subset. So once you know the base rules, you can kind of go from there. And so it's kind of interesting with this generativity, this ability to create sort of infinite meanings. I've run into an issue where in my study of chickadee calls, they combine their 4 notes in sort of an infinite possibility of ways, but the combinations also follow a set of rules. So they can only put B notes after A notes. So there's always A, then B, then C, then D. And they can omit some and include multiples. So it's sort of any number of combinations that you can make, but we can't indicate meaning. So we can't say that it's language. It's just a communicative signal, which is why this is an interesting topic to get into. And then the people who are picky about these terms and definitions and using them and applying them, those would be our psycholinguists. So someone who studies psycholinguistics, who studies the psychological aspects of language. So not just the linguistic part of it, not just the language itself, but also how we employ it, how we use it, and how it affects us as individuals. So we're looking at things like, how do people understand and produce and acquire their language abilities? What leads them to be able to communicate using language? And so we're going to focus on 4 main properties of language that have already kind of come up in our little discussion about what language is. So we're focusing on the symbolic nature of language. So we can use either spoken or written or signed words and symbols in order to communicate something. There's also semantics. There's meaning to what's being communicated. We mentioned the generativity, where you can put things together and make novel sentences and bits of information. And it's also structured. There are rules that help us govern how things are put together. And we're going to go into more detail on each of these. So when we're focusing on the symbolic and structured, we're going to start with, so sounds, signs, gestures, also written symbols. Symbols, we usually think of things that are printed on paper or things that show up on screens, but it can be pretty much anything. For language, the idea of something being a symbol is kind of like talking about perception and talking about a stimulus. It can be a little bit of anything. But these symbols are going to allow us to form and transfer mental representations, which is a fancy way of saying we can take the things that we're thinking inside our heads and externally express them. So if you're thinking that you're hungry and maybe you want to tell your friend that you want to go for food, you can say that. Or you can send them a text that says that. You're taking information that you knew, putting it out into the world, and then transferring that information to someone else so that they can act on it. And so these symbols are specifically going to be arbitrary. And that's because they don't necessarily look or sound or anything like the thing that they represent. So if you think of the word dog, if you think of it printed out or even said out loud, nothing about the shape or the sound of that word automatically links it to the creature, a dog. But we formed those connections. We understand that the word equates to that animal, that it's referring to that animal. So they aren't necessarily directly connected, but we understand that meaning. So they're arbitrary because they don't directly connect. And then if we wanted to talk about our structures, we were talking about the rules that govern how things are put together. So we could specifically talk about grammar, and that's our set of rules that dictate how symbols can be combined to create meaningful units of communication. So maybe you have rules about which letter follows another. With all of the silly English sayings, you have things like I before E except after C. That would be a grammar rule because it's telling us that the letter I should come before E unless there's something else going on. And that's kind of a bad example. English has lots of exceptions to its rules, but there are rules nonetheless. And then there's also things like the order in which words go. Do you talk about the noun and then the verb, or the verb and then the noun? So we have structures that you have to follow. And so for people who have grown up speaking a language, you learn grammar without necessarily realizing that you're doing it. But if you've had to learn a second language, you've probably had to sit down and learn the order in which words are presented. I've used quarantine to renew my knowledge of French. I took it all through grade school, middle school, and high school, and then I stopped, so I picked it up again, and I kind of remember some of the rules, but it's very much reversed from how English presents a lot of words. So I have to change my understanding of grammar because they have different rules than English does. And so different languages will have different rules and different things that matter, and they're all going to be presented in slightly different ways. All right, the next thing we're focusing on is the fact that language conveys meaning. And we gave the brief description that semantics refers to the meaning of both words and sentences. When we've talked about the semantics of a situation, it's what's going on, what does this mean? And so we've talked about, okay, so we're forming, transferring mental representations, specifically that have meaning. So we're sharing information between people. And that's another one of those terms. If you ever write a paper in this field, information is another contentious topic, because how do you define information? And how do you separate information from meaning if we're talking about non-human animals? Just saying, as someone who's had a paper returned on multiple occasions with issues with wording. Oops, did not mean to scroll there. Okay, and so we've said that, okay, yeah, we're using these arbitrary symbols. We've been using arbitrary words, things that don't necessarily directly connect to the thing that they're representing. And yet we all have an understanding of what it represents. We all have a mental representation of what a dog is. I don't have to show you a dog for you to know what I'm talking about. And so I can talk about taking a dog for a walk, and you can have a mental representation of that action because those words have meaning for you. But we also have sort of extra things that go on where there's more to our understanding, more to this meaning than just the words themselves. And this is, again, one of those hard things when it comes to learning a new language. A lot of sayings and phrases, they use words with meanings very different from how you would use them on their own. So if a friend comes out of a test, you both took the test together for the final exam, you walk outside, you ask them how they did, and they say they nailed it. Well, if you were taking that literally, they'd be talking about a hammer and nails. But that's not the context. In the context that we're in, we'd say, okay, it went really well. It's a phrase that has other meaning in specific contexts. So we have to keep in mind some of the social aspects. Who's saying it? Who are they saying it to? And what are the conditions in which it's being said? So we can have things where, okay, we understand that there's more there to it than just the direct translation of the words. All right, next we have generativity, which we talked about as being able to combine these symbols in an infinite number of ways in order to convey an infinite number of messages that each have novel meaning. So you can put words in different orders to say different things. One of the really useful parts about this, and I guess of language in general, is that we're not restricted to talking about things that are immediately in our presence. We're not restricted to the here and now. We can actually use what's called displacement. So we can communicate about events and objects that aren't physically present. So if you think about when a child first learns language and they maybe don't have their object permanence yet, they'll point at things that they see and they interact with things and they tell you about that thing that they can point at. But as we get older, we can start talking about things that happened yesterday or things that will happen tomorrow. Or I can stand up here and talk about walking an imaginary dog because I don't have dogs. I have birds, and you really don't want to try and walk them. But we're not restricted to only what we can point at, what we can immediately communicate about. We can sort of displace our conversation to talk about things that are sort of in other times or places, or even more important, things that don't actually exist. We can talk about figurative things, imagine if, and that's pretty interesting, and that comes from language. So we can symbolically represent past and future and imaginary events, not just the present. All right, and then back a little bit to talking about our structure, the meaning behind what it is that we're looking at. So we have two main types of structure that we typically care about, a surface structure and a deep structure. Our surface structure is basically the stuff that's on the surface. We're looking at how are the symbols combined. We're going to focus in on syntax rules for combination, so a subset of grammar. How are these words combined? What words are we using and in what order? Our deep structure, on the other hand, doesn't really care about the specifics of the words and how they're combined on the surface. They care about the underlying meaning. What's it trying to get across? So what's the underlying meaning of our combined symbols? We're going to look at what's called semantics. Again, the rules for connecting those symbols, the meaning behind those symbols. And so if we wanted something that has different surface structure, but the same deep structure, we can say that Mary went to the zoo or Mary visited the zoo. Different words, so different surface structure, went versus visited, but both have the same meaning. So both have the same deep structure. And then we can also run into an issue where, okay, that's fine if we're getting across the same meaning two different ways, but we can also have a single sentence, so one surface structure, that can be interpreted multiple ways. So we might have multiple deep structures or ambiguous semantics and ambiguous interpretations. So the example that I wrote down, because I always have trouble thinking of one on the spot, is that the police must stop drinking after midnight. We could interpret that the police should be doing their job to stop other people from drinking after midnight. Or maybe we're saying that the police themselves should not be drinking after midnight. Both are possible with that structure. So same surface structure, but two different interpretations, two deep structures, two meanings. And so when we sort of look at this sort of translation from the surface structure, because when we're communicating, we're paying attention to what people are saying, what words are they using, but then we almost translate it into what do those words mean? What are they trying to tell us? So we'd go from, okay, they're going to a party. And maybe the way that they've said it makes you think that maybe they want you to go with them. That could be part of the deep structure. And usually when we leave a conversation, we typically don't remember the surface structure. You don't remember exactly which words someone used to get a point across. You don't walk out of the lecture with an exact sort of script of what I've said to you during class, but maybe you've walked out with a summary of the concepts. You've taken the deep structure, you've taken the meaning, the important parts, and that's what you remember instead. All right, so that's sort of our qualities and setup for what language is and some of the things that make it unique. Now we're going to talk about the hierarchical structure of language. And this is basically looking at, okay, there are small, medium, large, and extra large components of language. How do we put these things together? And what are those different structures called? So I'm actually going to hop forward a couple of slides to show you the visual that goes with this. We're going to start at the bottom here. We're going to start with phonemes and work our way up to sentences. And that's the process that we're following. So if you have the slides, I'm not going to keep switching back and forth between them, but we're going to do each of these levels and talk about what each of them are and what they mean. So at the bottom of our pyramid, our hierarchy, we have our phonemes. And these are the smallest units of sound that can be recognized as separate. So these aren't individual letters, but these are instead sort of sounds that we can produce. They don't, I've already said, they don't correspond to letters of the alphabet. We can produce hundreds of phonemes. We aren't restricted to just the ones in our particular language, though we will eventually lose the ability to produce them if we don't use them after development. But we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But no language uses all of these phonemes, so each language will use a different subset. So if we think about English, English has 40 or so phonemes. And then other languages are going to have more or less. Some have as few as only 15, and some have as many as 80. So there's a huge range of the number of phonemes used in a different language. And it can be very difficult to learn a language that uses phonemes, that uses sounds that you're not familiar with. So maybe you're trying to learn a language and your pronunciation is awful because your native language doesn't include some of the really important sounds in the language you're trying to learn. All right. So we have our phonemes, our different sounds that we can produce. We can then combine them into morphemes. And these are our smallest units of meaning. So we go from only, all of our examples will be in English. So we had our 44-ish phonemes. They can be combined into more than 100,000 morphemes. So we can take all of those different sounds and put them together into these morphemes, which can get much, much bigger and much more complex. Not all morphemes are syllables. So there's a little bit of a weirdness here. So they're not exclusively words. Some of them are words, but some of them are also things that denote meaning. So if you think of the word bat, B-A-T, that would be a morpheme. And then if we wanted to pluralize that word, we want 2 bats. So we add an S at the end. The addition of an S has changed the meaning. We've pluralized it. So S on its own is actually a morpheme itself because it had meaning, because it tells us that there are more than one of the thing we've talked about. So morphemes can be words, but they can also be prefixes and suffixes that modify those words. Yep. I don't actually know. I'm sure there's someone who's done research on that because they do use them as stand-ins for words. And you can modify them by adding other symbols. Theoretically. Now I'm very curious as to whether or not someone has done that. I may have to check. Um, okay. So yeah, so the morphemes, I find that a lot of trouble is because we're talking about morphemes here, and then we will talk about words. There are some overlaps. Some morphemes are words, and some words are morphemes, but not always. Like an S on its own is a morpheme, but is not a word. And some words are going to be combinations of morphemes. So words can be more than, but morphemes are going to be those sort of simplest units of meaning. And the slide that has the hierarchical stack has examples there, so hopefully that'll help clarify them just a little bit for you. All right, and so our syntax is determining how these how these phonemes combine into morphemes. So how do we put together all of those sounds into things that have meaning? So some of them are going to be single letters, S or ED, implying sort of a past tense or pluralization. Some are going to be single syllable words, and then we can kind of build from there. All right. And so, as I said, words can also be morphemes, but not always. Sometimes they're combinations of morphemes. Phrases become conceptual units. So we put together multiple words to convey an idea. So if you're talking about a person doing something, that would be a phrase. So you're talking about sort of a noun and a verb put together, that would be a phrase. And then sentences are the final step in our hierarchy. That's a complete idea put together. So we would combine, say, multiple phrases into a sentence. And so our phrases, those conceptual units, they could be standalone. So you could sort of put them together and you have an understanding of what it is that you're talking about. It may not be a full grammatical sentence yet, but it expresses that concept. And I suppose I forgot to explain our number value. So we had said that we go from 40 or so phonemes up to 100,000 morphemes up to 500,000 words. So these numbers keep getting larger and larger. And that's that generative quality of language where as we add stuff together, there are more and more possibilities. And we can't put a number on the number of possible phrases and sentences because those are effectively infinite. All right, and so that brings us back to this chart that we started with. So if we look at the bottom row with our phonemes, you're going to find that there are some really weird symbols there. So these are symbols that are typically used by linguists to denote particular sounds. So if you've ever looked stuff up in a dictionary and they have sort of a pronunciation guide and sometimes they'll have weird symbols and they'll indicate if it's a hard A or a soft A. That's the same basic idea here. So it's just indicating which phoneme are we using, which particular sound do we have. And then we're going to combine them into those morphemes. And if we look at the word players, that's going to be a word, play, but also two suffixes. Meaning the person who is playing, and then S because there's multiple of them. So in that one word, we actually have 3 separate morphemes that get combined into the full word of players. And then with our phrases, we have the players, the people we're talking about. And we have what they're doing. They're talking to these other people. Those are 2 separate phrases. And we can combine it together into a complete sentence. And that gives us the fact that the players were talking to their fans. And so we can go beyond that. You can combine sentences into paragraphs and so on and so forth. But this is a pretty good place to stop for our hierarchy. So that kind of gives us, okay, we go from the smallest units up to full sentences, and we can have conversations. We can share information at that level. All right, so our next section is going to look at how we understand and produce language. And more so, this is going to show sort of how we set things up to understand and produce language, which processes might be involved at a very basic level, which parts of the brain might be involved, and what kind of sex differences do we see that we can debate about because they don't all agree on those. But now that we have that sort of basic understanding of what language is, we're going to talk about interpreting it and producing it. How do we understand what others tell us? How do we decide what to tell others? And everything in between. So we're going to start with bottom-up and top-down processing. And again, this is much easier because we've already talked about bottom-up and top-down processing in this course. I don't have to refresh your memory back to a previous class. We can talk about sort of using this concept again. So we had originally talked about this in sensation and perception, where we were looking at stimuli in the environment, and we were either putting together individual elements into a unified whole, or we were making assumptions based on the big picture, and then we could look at the elements to verify. So do we start at the bottom with our elements, or do we start at the top with a big picture? So our bottom-up processing is starting with those individual elements. So the individual elements of our stimulus are analyzed and combined to form a unified perception. So we're going to put together all those little pieces. So we can talk about, okay, the phonemes make up morphemes, and the morphemes make up words, and the words make up sentences, or I guess phrases and then sentences. So we can think of it that way. So when a child is learning to read, they'd probably sound out each letter, and they'd put it together, and once they sort of make the sounds together, maybe it sounds like a word. So they figure out that after sounding it out, they're saying the word cat. Okay, so they've put that together, but they started with each individual sound until they got to the word. And with the letter B that we have on the screen here, so we have different neurons in our brains that respond to different stimuli. We've kind of mentioned that we have like place cells and cells that respond to different orientations of lines. So we would have part of our visual cortex respond to the vertical line that is the spine of the letter B. And maybe we would respond to the horizontal sort of sticking out parts, and then the curves. And we can interpret all of those individual elements into this letter. Though we can also frame it at this point in our lives where we've seen the letter B often enough that we might sort of interpret it as, oh, it's a letter B. I already know that, especially if maybe we were looking at, maybe you're sampling fonts and they're going sort of A, then B, then C, so you can see all the letters together. So you know that it's a B because it's the second one and it's following the A and it looks like a B, sort of in the big picture. So that big picture down is when we get our top-down processing. And so this is when we have our sensory information interpreted in the light of existing knowledge and concepts, ideas, and expectations. So this is when we use stuff that we already know to make sense of the big picture that we're looking at. And so we use what are called mental sets, which are basically a perceptual expectation, sort of a framework of what we expect things to be. And so we've been listening to people talk for long enough in our lives that we have certain understandings of, an uptick at the end of a sentence usually denotes a question. Or there are long pauses between different sentences. Or the words and are they are irrelevant because there's someone sort of trying to grasp for words. So we have those basically rule sets that let us know certain things that can help us interpret this information. And so language is going to be mainly a top-down process once we've learned that language. So again, back to the language learning process. If you've tried to learn a second language, then you understand that when you start, every single piece has to be thought of individually, and then you have to put it together, and then put it into the larger concept. What does it mean? But once you know a language, You don't think about each individual word. You don't think about each individual sound within each word. So we sort of start with that big picture, and we only look more closely if there's ambiguity. And so this is something that's really important, especially when it comes to speech segmentation. And that's because if you've ever looked at a spectrogram of speech, which would be a graph that has, say, frequency on our y-axis, and the x-axis would just be time. So we're looking at the amplitude and different frequencies of sounds that are produced. Human speech is awful to look at. And that's because we do a very bad job of separating sounds. So even though you're understanding me speaking distinct words, you can break up what I'm saying into individual words. If we were, say, training an AI to pick out individual words, the AI would struggle because there aren't necessarily large enough gaps for them to realize what's happening. So we use our top-down processing and our very complex brains and our understanding of what words exist and which ones tend to follow one another to break down what you think someone is saying. But if we were using, say, a hard set of rules and a computer that just learned from exposure, the computer would actually struggle. And that's one of the problems that they have in trying to do things like speech recognition. So when I post my lectures on YouTube after classes, YouTube automatically puts up subtitles for me. And up until about the last year or two, that has not been a viable option because it had a lot of trouble picking up individual words. But their system has gotten complex enough and has been sort of evolved enough and has learned enough to figure out how to segment out different words in speech. But for us, we do that naturally from a very, very young age. And it's because we have that top-down processing. A little bit of an aside here from a study that I've looked at. When you think about it, so there are sort of pauses within sentences, or I guess within words sometimes. So occasionally there's, maybe we're talking about monocular cues, and I emphasize the two different syllables to make sure that you know what I'm saying. But when I'm saying monocular and then cues, if I say it quickly all together, it's monocular cues. There's more of a gap between mon and ocular than there is between monocular and cues. So if you looked at the duration, you actually find sometimes there are larger spaces within words than between words. And sometimes there are larger spaces either within or between words than even between sentences, especially when people are excited about something. And so this process of speech segmentation gets very, very complex because there's not a whole lot of consistency here. From my studies with chickadees, I look at sort of the spaces between their notes, individual notes, and they have nice, clean, consistent, like regimented spaces between notes. There's a little bit of variability, but not a whole lot. And even we can make artificial notes that follow the same rules and fit in, and the chickadees will treat them as pretty much normal. So it's something that is regimented and structured, but human language has evolved and shifted, and it's less consistent. And yet we still have no problem understanding which different words are being said, even if the spacing is a little bit off. So it's a little bit of a tangent there, but very, very interesting. So we use a lot of this top-down processing as we use language, but also a lot of bottom-up when learning a language. All right, so next we're going to talk about pragmatics. And this is just knowledge of the practical aspects of using a language. So I had kind of talked about the fact that context makes a big difference. So if you ask your friend how an exam went and they say they nailed it, you know that they did well on it, not that they were using a hammer and a nail on the test. So if we had things like, do you have time to explain this concept? Or do you have the time? One is asking, do you have a span in which we can sit down and discuss something? And the other is saying, what is the physical time on the clock? So we know in context and by other cues what the meaning is that we're trying to get here. So these are our practical aspects where sometimes the words aren't necessarily meaning the same thing. So it's a lot more than just a vocabulary and the grammar to put the words in the right order. It's also that deeper understanding of phrases and contexts and sayings, and especially social context. So how you're talking is almost more important than what you're saying. And we're also supposed to be very good at picking up on sort of underlying context. So sarcasm is a big one, where the words that you say go directly against the meaning. So if you say something sarcastically, like you come out of the test and you said, "Oh yeah, it went great," your friend knows that you didn't do well on the test, despite the fact that your words are saying that it was positive. So the social context can kind of change that surface level meaning of the words. And we also have to keep in mind that the target, sort of the two people involved, who's giving the information and who's receiving the information, also changes the dynamics a lot. Some things, again, under social context, are more or less appropriate depending on how you relate to one another. So maybe if you're talking to a supervisor, sarcasm and sayings are a little bit less appropriate. So you would stick to more direct, sort of level, the surface and the deep structure match. Whereas if you're talking to friends or equals, you'd be all right with sarcasm and joking around and colloquialisms. So there's lots and lots of things to consider there. All right, and again, I love that we've already done the different parts of the brain fairly recently, so I don't have to delve quite so much into this here. But I am bringing up our image of the brain as a little bit of a reminder about where language tends to be involved. So we've talked about Wernicke's area and Broca's area. Wernicke's is involved in understanding speech, and Broca's area is involved in speech formation. So if we look on the screen there, Wernicke's area is right around our temporal lobe. So that's where our auditory information is coming in. And so if we're understanding what's going on, we're able to take in what we're hearing or what we're seeing, because it's close to the sort of occipital lobe as well. It can give us some of that understanding that way as well. And then it would send information. It communicates with our Broca's area, because when we listen, we're usually thinking about what we're going to say in response. So Broca's area would take the meaning of what we're hearing and start formulating what's our response going to be. And then it sends that information up to our primary motor cortex, the thing that controls movement in our body, and it would control what our system does. What shape does our mouth make? How much air are we pushing forward? What sounds do we produce? So it's kind of a nice contained system where we have the input, helps us form what we're going to say, and then leads to that output. And of course, there are more areas in between, but we're going to kind of leave it at that, those major ones for now. Oh, and there was something interesting that I had noted here. The area where Broca's area is with our speech formation, it's also very, very close to the part of our brain that controls arm movements as well. So it's not just like our mouth and our vocal tract, it's also our arms and our hands and other parts of our body. And so that's maybe one of the reasons why we talk with our hands, where we can produce sounds, but they also tend to come along with hand gestures. One of the things that I really missed doing online classes where I would flail my hands about, but it's just my voice being recorded. So getting in person, you guys get to see those hand gestures as I demonstrate what the maps are saying in different areas. But it's probably because that part of the motor cortex that's closer by is also related to hand movements, not just the mouth. All right. Oh, and I'm looking back at my notes because I wasn't going to say everything that's on here. I just wanted to make sure I hit the highlights. But I made a note of something super cool in those exact words. But children who've been blind since birth actually have activation in that occipital lobe, which is usually devoted to visual information. It lights up in response to spoken language if they've been blind since birth, which tells us that that part of the brain has been sort of co-opted for systems that are actually needed. So if you don't need a visual system because you don't see, then we're going to make use of it. And we start seeing lighting up in the occipital lobe, even to spoken language. So something that should only be in the auditory areas of the brain also activates the visual areas as well, which is very cool. Okay, and I think, yeah, we're pretty close on time here. I have a couple more slides that are all about sort of imaging and sex differences and hemispheric lateralization, but I think we'll leave it here and I'll hop into those slides and then we'll continue on into development on Wednesday.